And I'm Brian Evans from the University of Alabama. Again, thanks to Sharon and Carl for inviting me to come up and be a part of this event. It's been a great couple of days. I'm going to probably cover a little ground that we've covered. I'll be skipping some things because fortunately colleagues over the past couple of days, we all seem to be walking many of the same streets here. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of my own work as an artist and composer and try to make some connections and resonances with the work of Xenakis. I thought I would start by going to his preface for the original English version of Formalized Music, just to sort of say these initial resonances where I definitely immediately connect with Xenakis. I am trained as a music composer, so certainly everything I do as an artist is within that context. That is my worldview, and it's something I think Michael Schumacher said yesterday. I consider myself part of this odd oxymoron called the experimental tradition, and I'm very much steeped in that. This sentence probably is where I connect with Xenakis in probably the most direct way, to materialize movements of thought through sound. And I would say specifically, I am an artist and composer, and I am fundamentally interested in making things and thinking things. That it's not just about making objects, but it's connecting them to some kind of conceptual base. As an artist, I work with numeric models, so I very much connect to the traditions of the idea to make art while geometrizing, and have to definitely look to and bow to Xenakis as sort of bringing those ideas to the fore as one of many thinkers in the mid-20th century who are starting to engage mathematics as a base of materials. And then this one is also in that preface from '62. We are so convinced of the historical necessity of this step that we should like to see the visual arts take on an analogous path. I heard the call, okay? So I thought I would start by playing a short example of what I do. I compose visual music. Again, my training is as a music composer, so in many ways, like Xenakis, I came to the visual world from a background of conservatory training as a music composer. So I was not a native of the world I came into, just as Xenakis came to the music world as an engineer and an architect. And there are certain advantages to that that I have found to be of great value, as Xenakis himself found to be of great value. As I think Joel said on Thursday, he wasn't constrained by the baggage that so many composers are constrained by. As Messiaen said, so don't worry about that baggage, just write. Okay. So let's start, and let's see if we can get this piece to play. This should be about 2 minutes long. Let's see if my little DVD player stutters a little bit, but Okay, to give you some idea of where I'm coming from as an artist and composer, this sentence here has sort of become my credo in life right now, and certainly my credo in practice. All that you can imagine, you already know. I think this is such a fundamental concept, and I want to expand on it again with sort of my understanding of the world and how we sort of work. All knowledge is built on prior knowledge. And the vehicle with which we construct that new knowledge is the concept of the metaphor. You have to make a connection to the new with something that you already know. And this is also how we actually create. Metaphors then are connections, mappings across different conceptual domains. And there's a lot of work going on in sort of the cognitive sciences right now that is starting to make a good, strong case for this concept of that all knowledge is built through the construction of metaphor. And I'd reference the work of Lakoff, Johnson, Turner, and a variety of researchers out there that are starting to develop this concept very strongly at the cognitive level. The metaphor, the map, becoming a very strong sort of basis for a variety of activities and a fertile world within which to work. So I come from an academic environment where we very much have as our values learning and innovation or creativity. And I love this sort of loop in talking about the concept of the metaphor as being the sort of the bridge through which we can construct knowledge. And it works in a couple different directions. Learning is really all about making the process of learning. We make the strange familiar. Again, all knowledge is built on prior knowledge. We have to construct some bridge between the strange to make it our own, to make it familiar to us. Creativity works in the opposite direction. Creativity is to make the familiar strange. Perhaps an architect making music, okay? It's this great path into creativity, and I like to play in this world of the map, in this world of the metaphor, because through these important metaphors, we can make these connections, we can learn, we can create. I, as an artist, make maps. I believe so did Xenakis, and this is one place where I think we have connections. Xenakis sort of came to the music world in the 50s, and I like to use the concept of entropy, and I've got to move through this quickly, coming from the sort of the second law of thermodynamics, and then sort of moving into these more general sort of metaphorical applications of it in terms of a definition of entropy, a measure of disorder, a measure of the loss of information, a measure of a state of inert uniformity, a state of steady deterioration. These states, entropy exists within a closed system, a system where no new energy is coming in. And I would contend that in Western music, post-World War II, common practice tonality, equal temper tuning, had brought music itself into a state of entropy because equal temper tuning itself was a closed system. What were composers doing in trying to extract some kind of juice out of this system that was finally moving to this static point of flat noise? Well, there were sort of two primary paths that were being followed. One, of course, was Boulez, and we've heard this talk of pure determinism coming on. This is just kind of a fun thing to do, so I thought it would be fun to play a little bit of structures. This piece that's credited in the early 1950s as being sort of the monument of total rationalism, pure determinism, full, complete serialism of all the musical dimensions, written for the instrument that is the penultimate instrument of equal temperament and common practice tonality, the piano. And I think that's enough for now. And there was another path, of course. There was the path of pure chance, as articulated by Cage moving where you take the composer completely out of the process and allow random chance processes, again, working within this closed system of equal temperament, this closed system of the piano. We had written the same year as Structure's Music of Changes. That's enough of that. And something that I learned from old composition instructor Mel Powell, what would happen if we played them together? Interesting. So I would contend chance and control within this closed system aren't two ends of a continuum, but are actually the connection of a loop. And Xenakis himself understood this. Pure chance and pure determination are only two facets of one entity. This was the point of entropy in music in the 1950s, and Xenakis said, you know, there's another way. He opened the system. When you open the system and you can bring new energy in, all of a sudden there are new possibilities. So what are some of the things that he brought, even with his early work? He brought in the pitch continuum. Of course, Xenakis wasn't the only composer doing this, but this was what was happening in the 1950s and explains so much of why there was this wonderful moment of great problem and great possibility in terms of music composition post-World War II. The pitch continuum, the idea of mapping numbers to music events, the ideas of mapping music events to architecture, again, making these connections between the strange and the familiar as you bridge these disciplines. As Xenakis himself said, music and architecture found an intimate connection. And we won't spend time with this because we've done this in great depth over the past couple of days. And here's sort of the penultimate example, where he's making these events that are, transcend equal temperament, transcend the baggage of that conservatory tradition that Joel Chatterby talked about on Thursday, and was able to map that into a visual space as well. And then getting even more complex in terms of the numeric models he was using as he starts to bring in these stochastic processes to become the generators of the events, and then sculpting those to create the musical events that developed this whole language that he brought to us in the 50s and then expanded. Then I'm a digital artist, so I started to connect to this as I discovered the computer back in the 1980s, and I work from this fundamental base, digital as discrete and numeric. I work in a visual space where, of course, whenever I'm looking at images, at their core, artists always like to get down to the materials, but the materials of a digital image, of course, is the binary encoding. Just as the materials of a digital sound is reduced down to its binary coding. Well, Xenakis recognized this in discussions of the diatope. If music from now on is well and truly immersed in computer science, so too can be the art of light. Xenakis again made the bridge, and it's the bridge I use as a base for much of what I do. If a digital image can be a number and a digital sound can be a number, then any image can be a sound, any sound can be an image. All you're doing is changing the mapping. Okay? A sound and an image each become a metaphor for each other, and maps are metaphors. So we recognize metaphors in a variety of ways. This is an audience that probably actually recognizes this metaphor. This is a metaphor for something we call the Mandelbrot set. And I always love when I see an n and an n-1, it means that I'm learning something about the present based on what I know about the past. So it becomes this wonderful bridge. I, as a digital artist, am able to turn this into a discrete and numeric representation by being able to encode it. Once I've converted this into a digital representation, I now have a grid of numbers. I can take those numbers and I can map them into colors, and I can make an image, a map, of that mathematical function. But this is not a fractal. This is not the Mandelbrot set. This is a metaphor for the Mandelbrot set. It's a conceptual metaphor for the Mandelbrot set because I can actually have a discussion about the Mandelbrot set. There's things to be learned about the Mandelbrot set from this map. And this is the value of metaphor. But because I've abstracted to number, I can just as easily turn those numbers into musical information. And I was working in sonification so long ago. When I first started this work, I enjoyed working in fractals because I wasn't a visual artist, and it was a way to actually generate visual imagery for me because I could code. But then it occurred to me, well, if I've got this image, well, let's actually run this. If I've got this little animation running, where I can see this sort of global behavior over time, what if I actually traced sonically these 4 points in the image so that I could hear what's going on with the 4 trees while I'm watching the forest unfold before me? The idea of being able to sonify aspects of this process while I can visualize others. And then it becomes an issue of mapping. What if I map those 4 points into 4 octaves of a quarter tone scale, and then I sample the time of those 4 voices? Let's see. Oops. Louder. At different sample rates in time so that I actually get an aperiodic rhythmic space. Fairly simple mapping constrained by a fat Mac and a little MIDI synthesizer back in 1988, but still this ability to map from one space to another because of this level of abstraction. But as a composer, as an artist, I have many degrees of freedom in the construction of the map. I can take the exact same process and map it into the black notes of the piano and let everyone play the same 16th note rhythmic space. I loved it when a mathematician came up to me and says, I always knew fractals could sound beautiful, or would sound beautiful, and I didn't have the heart to tell him, no, I'm only letting the fractals play the black notes of the piano. So there's lots of degrees of freedom within the construction of these maps that are purely aesthetic decisions when you're working from an artist standpoint. This is one of my favorite maps. This is a two-dimensional image that's representing a sonic entity or a temporal entity. Yes, we recognize it as a musical score, but all it really is a two-dimensional image. What it is actually telling us is what we can recognize through this is the unfolding of frequencies in time. I can map that into a sort of grisly numeric expression of frequencies and phases so that I now have it as a formulaic description, and all I've really done now is take out my Mandelbrot set equation and plug in this equation that's a representation of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. I process it, I get a grid of numbers, and I can map Ode to Joy into an image. Right. Again, once you're in this digital space, you can do this dance. I can do these maps across there, and because there's so many degrees of freedom, I can do this forever. Because I'm bringing in my aesthetic input, my personal subjective input into the process, into the mapping process as we engage. And we know a lot of different ways where we can take these visual representations of sonic entities and we can learn about them. We understand the idea of the sonogram, where I can say this word and I can see this graphic representation and I can see the harmonics of the vowels and I can see the energy of the noise. And with the right software, I can take this image and I can actually resynthesize to some degree the sound, even this low-resolution version. This becomes really useful for me. And Xenakis understood this too. You can create these sort of simple graphic representations of time and space, and they can be mapped into sonic activities, which is the whole adventure of the UPIC, is that you can literally draw, and you can map that to pitch, you can map that to rhythm, you can map that to timbre, and you're in this sort of rich space where you can take this two-dimensional visual static environment and turn it into this temporal musical environment. And again, playing within this space of mapping and taking advantage of the digital environment. Of course, once you have this ability to take a two-dimensional image and map it into a sonic space, of course, it doesn't really matter what the image is. The computer doesn't care. And as long as you've got an interesting procedure, you can take any image and turn it into a sound. So as an artist, I can turn very much to these sort of paths that Xenakis has opened up and begin to exploit them for my own particular interests as I'm trying to understand this bridge between image and sound and the ability to construct these metaphors, these sort of cross-sensory metaphors. So I work these days with what I call time slices, where I create these animations and I literally slice them in the time domain to create a two-dimensional static representation. So if you have this animation running, this line, this white line across here is the scan line of interest, and across the bottom I can see what the contents of that scan line is as this animation unfolds. And the result is I get this two-dimensional image that shows me how that one particular line is varying in time. At the end of this, I end up with this image that then becomes this slice of the temporal domain, if we think of this animation as an object that you can slice temporally. But now, again, I have this static image. And once I have this static image, I can then map it into sound and get a sonic representation, again, of this temporal space. And then these can be things that I can hear. So Photoshop becomes often my primary compositional tool as I look at these images and I say, well, gee, it would be really fun if I could just get this down to some line details so I can do an inversion, I can do an edge detection, and then I can map that into some kind of sonic space. And again, I have lots of degrees of freedom in what I can do in taking the very same image source and mapping it into a variety of sonic spaces. And often the composer in me, again, I will reference Mel Powell. I remember Mel back in my orchestration studies saying, Brian, when you got a lot of stuff going on, when you got a lot of activity, you need to inertify the active. So I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to inertify the active? And I go, I know, I'll use the blur tool. So I go into Photoshop, hit the blur tool, and now all of a sudden I can get some of these other kinds of things to combine. And I start to basically build this ensemble of maps, all generated from a map that I've constructed from an animation. So and then what I have here are a variety of maps that become one big heterophonic texture in the construction of a music composition. But of course, one of the voices is missing. So maybe we'll hear everyone together and see them too. So you get this sense of this bridge, these cross-disciplinary metaphors, and then we come back to the why, which is always the thing that's most important to me. And we, composers for so many centuries, I think, have fallen back to this very simple explanation that Stravinsky so eloquently described. Music means nothing outside itself. Right, which is another way of saying art for art's sake, which is this early modernist idea, what we call formalism with a capital F. And it becomes this sort of way of explaining the work and is often used as a way of explaining work that has that mathematical basis. But I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this worldview, and this sort of is the Hollywood description of creativity, is that God has put this stuff out there in the air, and there are these savants they call artists that somehow are able to receive those signals and manifest them as objects. And this becomes problematic on all sorts of interesting ways, but ends up being very much that early modernist idea, the Clive Bell idea of these mysterious laws and aesthetic ecstasy that artists connect with. And certainly for digital artists, there are lots of things to consider. I've excerpted some this from this website, talking about the concept of mapping and the idea of mapping as being a justification for a work. Every digital coding is arbitrary. This is the value and the joy I have in the maps that I make, is they are arbitrary, and that I get to bring in a lot of subjective processes into the construction of what comes out. So as a critic, as the Vedi Mikam here is saying, wonder if the artist brings a shape, a meaning, a style. There is something that this is about beyond saying it's a map, right? So the whole idea of the metaphor itself becomes an important thing to think about in terms of constructing meaning. And of course, Cage finally articulated this in contrast to Stravinsky. He says, music means nothing in itself, right? It's this thing out there, and I believe that Xenakis. I have sort of a different read on Xenakis, and this read sort of came to me as I was reading from the two books of his that I have, and trying to come to grips with him in the context of sort of my worldview as it's evolved over the past 10, 15 years. I love this from music and architecture. Marxism's mortal sin consists of believing that the day will come when society will be rid of all of its contradictions. This is not a modernist statement. Right? This is not a belief in a grand narrative, whether it's Marxism or otherwise. He's not perhaps seeing this grand destiny out there, but understanding that there are these contradictions in society that are always going to be there. And I find these things interesting as I go through Xenakis' writings, especially the writings. I mean, you can't take what he wrote in 58 and think that was the same man in 1990 or 1995. His thinking is going through much as the world is going through much. Knowledge is a secretion of the history of humanity, formed by the innumerable movements of its cultures. It's not out there, it's here. Yes. We face a frightened fundamental doubt as the true objectivity of our knowledge. He's starting to, I mean, this is a postmodern concept. He's really starting to think in terms of who he is as a composer and what his work really means in terms of society as it was defining itself and continues to define itself. And I find connections here with Xenakis. And again, these are just sort of peripheral readings, and I'm now inspired after this conference to start digging a little deeper, because I think Xenakis from the 1980s and the 1990s wasn't the same Xenakis who was writing formalized music in 1958. I think we can look to him, and how I look to Xenakis now, first and foremost, as a model of courage and optimism. This is where I think Xenakis might stray from what seems to be often the postmodernist urge. Xenakis was an optimist. He had faith in humanity's potential, but if you read, especially in his later writings, it's not a destiny, it's a potential. Right? Humanity has this ability, this possibility, but it's not necessarily a given. He believed that we are evolving, or we have the potential to evolve to recreate our universe. And he's prescient in that way. If you start to look at cognitive science, as you start to look at what's going on in our technologies, in our biotechnologies, in our computational technologies, we are moving to where we are in a position to perhaps start recreating our universe. We have that potential, but it's not necessarily our destiny. I think Xenakis thought that music can provide a model, a place to practice and prepare for the realization of that potential. I think Xenakis felt that for the artist, we can help move things in the right direction. And this was what the work, the meaning, the connection of so much of his work was about. Music is but a path among others for a man, for his species, first to imagine. All we can imagine, we already know. So it's constructing knowledge, building that knowledge so that you can expand your imagination. And then after many, many generations, to entail this existing universe into another one fully created by man. I'm not sure I see this as a grand thing, but as a hopeful thing about who we as a civilization can be. So this is my sort of extrapolation of Xenakis into my own practice, and we're not necessarily walking the same path, but we're definitely in the same forest. And even today, I'm constantly finding our trails crossing as I, as an artist, seek to imagine and create. And I will confess, I aspire to one day share his optimism. Thank you.